So what brings you here?
Well, what brings you here is that the theme of this year's summer reading program is Color Our World with Arts, and our film is art. I want to reach out to different art organizations here in the Detroit area, see if come and talk about it, to publicize it, get them publicity to share what's great about them, what's important, and so I'm very pleased and happy and thankful that you could join us tonight. Yeah, Ms. Wilhelm has been the director of the Detroit Film Theater at the Detroit Institute of Arts since 1973, and has been the curator of film there since 1984. It's one of the best and most acclaimed and best attended film programs in the nation, right? Over 5 million moviegoers. So Mr. Wilhelm, he's taught at William State. His reviews have been shown, has been all over the place, different radio stations, different TV stations, and he's written a book, Video Hounds World Cinema, The Adventurous Guide to Movie Watching. So I'm very pleased. Let's welcome Mr. Elliot Wilhelm.
It sounds like a lot more of you than there are in here. This is great. My book, Video Hounds World Cinema, by the way. Can you still hear me? Because I can't hear myself. Okay. You can get it on Amazon for, I think, 79 cents. It's my alternate title as an author is On the Remainder, which is a term for, well, we've still got a few of these books that we haven't sold yet.
Oh,
so it had one big press run in 1998. The rest are on remainder, but you can find them. My biggest thrill was when I actually saw a copy at the Strand bookstore in New York, which is a great used bookstore.
Yeah.
It's great if you're looking for film stuff. You can find them online also, but if you're ever in New York and you haven't been there, it's one of the great tourist attractions, I think. Better than going to the Empire State Building. If you're a book lover, it's just wonderful.
We have a copy upstairs too, or we used to anyway. It's
Or
at
you
the
can
reference desk.
get it at your local library. Yeah.
It might be referenced, but yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you because I did it. Had so many great experiences at the Art Institute with films back to Diva, to the piano, the Yee, back to art when you had a series of Alfred Hitchcock films. I saw his second one, I forget the name of it, his second he ever made.
Oh, right, okay. The second film, not Downhill, no, that was, I'm all confused on his early, very, very early silent films.
Something
Without the Lodger.
Yeah, something about suspicion or something, I want to say. But yeah, I just...
And feel free to chip in, folks.
Oh, yeah.
Chip right up. I'm losing a few facts lately due to advanced decrepitude, so feel free.
But so I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being able to putting everything together. How did you become director of the film theater?
It was almost an accident, but it was also something that I thought might be fun. I always loved going to the movies. Honestly, I'm not going to try to give you my life story, and I've got what they used to call a frog in my throat, which I'm assuming will go away at some point or hop out. But when I was a kid, my parents, for one reason or another, they weren't poor, but they didn't want to ever leave me with a babysitter. So when they went to the movies, they took me. And they took me to what seems to me, in retrospect, like an extraordinary number of inappropriate movies for someone who was 5 years old to be taken in, speaking of Mr. Hitchcock, taken to the Royal Theater on 7 Mile Road in Detroit to see Rear Window. Now, when you're 5 years old, there's no way you can tell what's going on in the world, except on your own terms. And somehow Hitchcock was such a great director that I remember the experience, and I remember being scared. And if you look at Rear Window objectively, and most of you I'm sure have seen it, you wonder how a kid can really be scared unless they're really paying attention to the dialogue. It's just a bunch of people in different windows, and you don't know how to put it all together. But according to my mother, about halfway through the movie, I began screaming and crying so horribly that they had to take me out and ultimately took me home. So my mom was upset because it was at least a decade before she finally saw all of Rear Window when it was shown on TV, when it was shown on like NBC Sunday night movie, something like that. I grew up loving Rear Window and loving all of Hitchcock's films. There was a period of time in which you couldn't see certain Alfred Hitchcock movies. This is probably not germane, going off the rails, but it's on my mind. I feel like I'm in a therapist's office. And many of Hitchcock's films disappeared until around 1984, I think it was, when a handful of the great ones from the 1950s were reissued, and that includes Vertigo. One of the reasons he pulled them out of release, and he owned most of his films, beginning with Rear Window. He knew what a great director he was. He knew that Paramount and later Universal, some of his distributors, had great deals on them and could reissue them, almost like Disney movies. They stayed fresh to audiences who liked seeing suspense films, but he owned the negatives. That was part of the arrangement he made with distributors from the mid-1950s on. So he took Rear Window and Vertigo, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and Rope, a number of his most important films you couldn't see for many years, except at this little film festival in southwest Colorado, Telluride, Colorado, where there were certain folks, one film curator from the Eastman House in particular, who got permission to show once a year one of the disappeared Hitchcock films at midnight in their main viewing place. And people went to Telluride for a while every year just to see what the Hitchcock movie was going to be that year. And it became a real phenomenon. Anyway, when I finally saw Rear Window, I was pretty much an adult. Most of you have seen it. Most of you remember that Raymond Burr was the killer. Lars Thorwald, who was in the apartment across from Jimmy Stewart's, who was having an affair, talked to his girlfriend on the phone, murdered his wife. Sorry, I'm not giving anything away here. If you don't know what happened in Rear Window, you probably don't belong here anyway. But and he chopped Mrs. Thorwald into small pieces. I don't know how small all of them were, but they were pieces, and that got the job done. So many years later, my father, who was then old, had a portrait done by a local artist himself. He was a doctor, and he had the portrait done wearing his white doctor coat. Being a doctor was very important to him, sort of defined him. And one day I was watching Rear Window again, and I realized something really extraordinary. At that point, when my dad was old, in that portrait in particular, my father looked exactly like Raymond Burr did in Rear Window in 1955. He just wasn't old enough yet. And Raymond Burr walked around in that white wife beater t-shirt thing that he wore. And could I have been scared in advance? Could this have been like a preview? I was afraid of my dad. And I think he might have chopped up my mom and put her in his trunk in the film. All these things really freaked me out. But I was taken to that. 1957, when I was 7 years old, my parents took me to see Rebel Without a Cause. I shouldn't say they took me to see it, but they went to see it, and I was there because they couldn't get a babysitter. I was afraid to go to high school after Rebel Without a Cause because I thought, I'd have to be in knife fights, and I'd have to drag race with kids who were bigger than me, and maybe go over the cliff. All this stuff, I believed everything I saw at the movies. I believed it in a way that I didn't pay attention to real life. And I messed up real life in many ways, but I was very loyal to the movies. And I remembered what I saw, and I was really, really thrilled by it. One of the the movies that screwed me up even further was one that was supposed to be for kids, and that was Walt Disney's Pinocchio.
Yeah.
Those films were, like the Hitchcocks, the Disney features from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs up through Pinocchio and many of the other stuff, much of the other stuff that followed, Fantasia and so on. Those films were released every 7 years to appeal to a new generation of young people. So there was always the chance as a kid, no matter when you grew up, after 1945, 41, I think, of seeing a Disney film, being taken to a Disney animated feature when you were very young. And I was taken to see Pinocchio probably in 1957 or 8. And it blew my mind. It was like the most horrifying thing and the most beautiful thing I ever saw. And of course those movies were called kids' films. And they appealed to kids because of all the fuzzy animals and all of the kid stuff that happened in them. But they all, they played below the belt. Disney showed Pinocchio, taken off to Pleasure Island. Hey kids, you can do anything you want. You can drink beer, you can play pool, you can smoke, you don't have to go to school. What happens to you if you do that? They didn't tell them that in advance. You get turned into a jackass and, real donkey. Put in a cage, sent off to a zoo, and as is spoken in the movie, left on his own, a boy will always make a jackass out of himself. And Pinocchio goes off screaming, "Mama, Mama," they're taking him away. This is for children? This is like their worst nightmare. And what happened to Bambi's mother? I mean, you take a look at and Dumbo. All of these things are terribly traumatizing to children. I was a film critic for a time at Channel 2 in Detroit. And it was at a time when their ratings were really bad. So they let me review new movies as long as I wanted to on the air. It would be 5 minutes. And the sports guy there, Charlie Neal, was really angry. He said, "You give me 6 minutes for the sports, but this guy you let up, at the desk talk for 5 minutes about nothing." Well, he was probably right. But one night, I was talking about a reissue of Bambi, and I was talking about this very subject, about how kids were often really, really freaked out by these movies. And of course, at the end, they always say, all of us kids said at the end, "Can we see that again?" And of course, that's because the Disney people were smart enough to know that if a kid can go through that and survive it and come out, and there's a happy ending, how did that happen? It's a way of dealing with lots of problems. I'm not a psychologist, but I went to a lot of movies, and I sort of realized that. But I said on the air that some people, some psychologists, have found what could almost be perceived as, I think the way I put it, was a kind of a sadistic streak in some of these films when it comes to the vulnerabilities of small children. Okay, this was a live show. I walk into the studio right after getting off the air and talking for way too long, like I am right now. And all the phones are ringing in the newsroom. The anchor's name was Roy Weisinger, very sweet guy. He looked at me and said, "What did you say?" I said, "What do you mean, Roy?" "You answer these phones." Everybody in here is answering phones saying you called Walt Disney a sadist. And, did I? No, but it was a valuable lesson in that when you're broadcasting, especially with television, I think, people are listening maybe, it's on, but they're listening with sort of half an ear. And they hear certain things, that's like high notes, certain things that set them off. And if you put the word Disney and sadist in the same sentence, you are going to be interpreted as calling this guy a war criminal of some kind. So I answered a lot of those phones, but I came this close to being fired, and I really needed the $40 a week too. But it was exciting because I learned doing live TV that you gotta be careful what you say. And these are things that much of society right now could probably benefit from learning. but nevertheless, it was a really interesting thing to me. Okay, I think your original question was, how did I get into this?
Yeah.
This is how I got interested in it. was understanding the power of movies. And I wanted to tell my friends when I saw a movie, whether it was, as a kid I was also interested in really cheesy horror movies. In the 1950s, I grew up in what they call the golden age of radiation. You know, there were all these, it was the Cold War, and aliens and monsters were all, you know, metaphors for communism, and they can look like you, they can imitate you, but they don't have emotions. They're the enemy. They're dangerous. Stay away from them. I loved all these movies, and went to see them kind of religiously. Every Saturday they had special kids matinees, and I began to fall also in love with the whole idea of the theater, of the movie theater. When the lights go down, all these unruly kids would somehow get really excited and pay attention to what was going on the screen. They might make fun of it, and they might scream and throw popcorn boxes, but it was a thing. There was a reason that they were there. They were having a time. It was kind of echoed in a movie made many years later, Gremlins, which some of you might have seen. There's a scene in Gremlins where, and the Gremlins just wreak havoc everywhere after they turn into the bad Gremlins. Where are all the Gremlins? They're gone. And the lead character says, they're in the theater. They're watching Snow White, and they love it. And they do. They were just staring at the screen and being bad, making fun of everything, but they couldn't take their eyes off the screen. They were entranced by it. And I thought, that's kind of brilliant filmmaking. That's what they would do. Well, my folks took me not only to inappropriate movies, but they also took me one day to the DIA to see somebody named George Perot. Anybody remember George?
Yes, yeah.
George was a pioneer in a sense. There were other people who did this, but George was the best at it. He was a member of the Circumnavigators Club. He was a wonderful raconteur. I got to know him years later. But he had this show on Sundays at the DIA called the World Adventure Series, and it was silent 16mm travelogues made by people who did this for a living. They would travel around the world and take pictures of somebody riding a bike across the Colorado Rockies, and they would stop and look at something interesting. Whatever it was, they ran about an hour, generally when spliced together. Some were in color, some were in black and white. They were all silent. And the gimmick was that the person who made the travel film was there in person to narrate it. That's where the sound came from. And they were all entertainers in a sense. They were almost like descendants of vaudeville. They got up on stage and they did a shtick. And they did jokes that were pretty well rehearsed, and their audiences loved it. And there were some of them, like Stan Midgley, who was the Colorado bicycle guy, who became superstars on that circuit. And it was like you could have a concert series, and people would go, but then there would be one real, like, superstar you couldn't get tickets for. And I think it was Stan Midgley that my parents took me to see. They decided this would be fun, you know, let's get out and do something that's really live. George Perot, by the way, had a show on Channel 4.
Saturday nights.
And that show would sort of preview what was going to be on Sunday at the DIA.
Yeah.
And he would have the person who was going to do the Sunday thing. It was very crude television in those days. George Perot was sitting in one chair, and the guest, Stan Midgley or whoever it was in the other, and then they would run on TV some of the silent footage, and the travel dog would talk. But at Channel 4, they kept both mics open. And invariably, about 4 minutes into the silent films on live TV, you would hear from the other chair, George was sound asleep. And he would wake up at the commercial, I'll stand, okay, Sunday at the Detroit Institute of Art. And I was taken there to see one of these, and it was filled, it's 1,000 people. And at the end, there was a lineup of people who were saying goodbye to George Perot personally. He was shaking hands with every guest who left and introducing their children. This is Mr. Perot. This is George Perot. And he was so nice to them. He was so nice to everybody. It was going to the movies, but it had something that I hadn't seen before. There was a kind of personal quality. It was like a live performance and movie. And I loved the room. I loved the auditorium at the DIA. And eventually, as I got older, I met the guy who started running it in the 1960s. His name was Audley M. Grossman Jr. The theater never really fell into disrepair, but it wasn't used a lot at that point. The theater was built in 1927 as part of the original Detroit Institute of Arts. It's a magnificent theater, and it was designed with all of the sort of DIA design touches. It was designed to be part of the original museum building, made in 1927 at 5200 Woodward. There had been a Detroit Museum of Art that ran out of room for all the great things that were coming into the DIA's collection. And it is one of the world's greatest museums. So they built this place at 5200 Woodward, and the architect, C. Howard Crane, and Albert Kahn, who also worked on the DIA, thought that a large auditorium for doing lectures on art, for an orientation space to the collection, to do plays, to do poetry, to do music, and to do film would be a great addition and modernization of what a traditional art museum does. And it was designed to kind of be the centerpiece of the museum. There were people who showed movies from 1927 as an art form, not just, here's a movie that shows you how to make pottery or how to paint. And we predated the Museum of Modern Art in New York by about 3 months in terms of showing film as an art form. They won an Oscar, MoMA, for their art, their film exhibition. We have yet to win an Academy Award, but give us a little time.
With popularity, you'll get there.
So in 1970s, early 1970s, late 1960s, early 70s, exhibition in the United States was changing. The studio system was disappearing. Independent filmmaking, so-called independent filmmaking from younger filmmakers like Arthur Penn, who made Bonnie and Clyde, and Dennis Hopper, who made Easy Rider. There were different kinds of films that were being tried that in some ways alienated some of the older viewers. John Schlesinger's Midnight Cowboy was one of them. And there were films from all over the world as well, which had been shown earlier than that at independent theaters. In Detroit, there was the Studio Theater at Livernois and Davison, and there were others as well. But things were changing in terms of demographics, where people lived, and the advent of the multiplex theater, in which you could see more than one movie in the same building. And the financial picture changed a lot for movies then. But that feeling of all going to a movie together, to see whether it's the new Ingmar Bergman movie or the new Francois Truffaut movie in the late 1950s and early 1960s in one theater, the manager would be there to talk to you about it afterwards. The art house experience was unique, and it also became pretty much economically not viable any longer. Those theaters closed, not just in Detroit, but around the United States. And the often too maligned National Endowment for the Arts in the early 70s saw this as not just a problem for the movie business, but a serious problem for what they considered to be a genuine art form, and that's motion pictures. For people not to have access to new independent films or foreign film or documentaries because these large theater complexes were not showing them. They didn't pay, they didn't bother, they didn't waste the screen space on those. And the older ones were disappearing. They said, we've got to do something to rescue this. You have to remember, at the time, of course, you couldn't go to a library and take out a movie. No. The idea was...
It was pop in a DVD.
Right.
It didn't exist.
No. When I saw a movie that my friends didn't see at the local theater, they knew that it was gone, and there was no way they were going to see it. So what we used to call bell work. Before the bell rang and the kids were in their seats, they had to be entertained somehow. I would get up and tell them the plot of a movie that they might not have seen, because I was a real ham bone, and I liked doing that. But it also made me kind of get in touch with storytelling, and I liked it, and I liked the idea of making them feel sad that they missed something truly great, and it usually wasn't, but nevertheless,
People like storytelling.
they like storytelling, even though I always stretched it out. But the National Endowment for the Arts said this is a serious thing, because, as I say, there was no other way. If you didn't see a movie when it was first released, chances are you weren't going to see it ever. At least that was what people believed, and was true until the change came in being able to see movies on videotape, and ultimately on DVD, and ultimately on cable, and ultimately on streaming and Blu-ray, and so many other ways of seeing movies that you missed, which you could do at your leisure and in many different ways. But that wasn't possible in this era. So the NEA decided to try and do something about it. They gave out grants of $10,000 to 4 institutions, nonprofit institutions in the United States that had applied for them.
Okay.
The Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, the Northwest Film Study Center in Portland, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Detroit Institute of Arts got one of them. In 1973, I had my first real job, which was doing newscasts at a radio station on Grand Boulevard. I'd been in some broadcast courses at Wayne State, where I went, and I was doing the morning thing and the afternoon drive time thing, and it was fun to do. But between them, if the Watergate hearings weren't really good that day, which was what I was usually watching on TV, between morning drive time and afternoon drive time, I would walk over to the DIA, because it was pretty short hop. And one day I talked to the guy who ran the theater then, Audley Grossman, who had been thrown out of the museum for being annoying. He was an employee designed to bring in performing arts, designated performing arts person, but he was very contumacious and was always angering the serious curatorial folks who were doing their jobs. So they banished him, but instead of really banishing him, they just took him off the official DIA payroll and had him open a private nonprofit corporation, and he leased his services to the museum. The guy was actually brilliant, and he wrote the puppetry section in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was a huge thing at the time. And
I
puppetry,
remember
yeah.
going to puppet shows there.
Yeah, and puppetry was his thing, and he began collecting them. We had a director as recently as 25 years ago who wanted to just get rid of the puppet collection. And the puppet collection at the DIA is fantastic. It's like second only to the one in Atlanta. There's a huge puppetry thing. Jim Henson, I would see in the office occasionally later on. He came to see Audley. They would talk puppets, and he gave us one of the 2 original Kermits, which we still have. We have one of the 3 Howdy Doodies that was donated to us by Buffalo Bob Smith, and there was sort of a fight over it when Bob Smith died and all of that, but we legally had it and have it. I got to do the voice of Howdy Doody when the postmaster came to do a stamp for Howdy Doody. They introduced it at the DIA, and somebody was operating the marionette, and I learned from one of Howdy's original writers who lived here in Detroit how to do his voice, and he gave me the official okay to welcome the postmaster and to admire his stamp too.
Can we hear it?
So no, it would have the same effect as seeing Rear Window when I was 5 for you. So you don't want to do that. So he told me about this grant and said, "Would you be interested?" Because I was just always talking about movies. And he said, "We think the theater's underused and we would like to do it." So it was a $10,000 grant. I interviewed with a bunch of other people. I got the job. And the job, I didn't know what it was. It was just programming films. And there were so many great films at that point in late 1973 that had not played Detroit, that I had heard of and seen in the New York Times news about and read reviews of, but still hadn't had a chance to see myself, that it was kind of like scooping up gold from I felt like one of those old panhandler, not panhandlers, but panhandler for gold.
This
Right?
one?
Yeah, that's right. Big nuggets. And the big question was, what do we do with the $10,000? Because it would seed my There was not going to be any more. They made that clear. They sent me down to Washington, too, to be interviewed for the job. They took me very seriously. And I decided that what we should do is, that it's too hard on audiences if you say, we're going to show one movie a month, or every 2 weeks there's going to be a film. That it's asking a lot of people, that there were so many great films that if we showed a brand new movie that had never been shown in Detroit every week, on Friday nights only, and on Saturdays we showed classics, older films, and Sunday, sometimes we'd show stuff, sometimes we didn't. But we would go through all the money in the first 6 months, and then that would be it. So it either worked or it
Right.
didn't, and I convinced them to go for it. And they told me at the radio station they'd hold my job for me until I failed at this. And they told me at the museum that if the program even came close to breaking even, they'd try to keep it going if it worked. And it worked. It worked. I think it wasn't be for audiences, but we had lots of help. One of the people who helped me the most, and I've tried all these years to make it look like I did it all alone. Of course, that's absolute nonsense. We have an incredible crew of people and have overturned generations of great people at the DIA who have helped to make it all possible. But there were other people at the birth of the Detroit Film Theater who were invaluable. One of them was this library's head of audiovisual, I can't remember his exact title, but his name was James L. Limbacher. He was a genius. Jim was a wonderful man, and he kind of took me under his wing and showed me stuff. He showed me films in the collection here. He had a lot of ephemeral movies about what you shouldn't do on a date in 1957. Should you go to the prom or shouldn't you? How to drive safely, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do anything. And these films are wonderful, and there are now places online where you can see many of them. And Jim saw the value in collecting these things. And he was like the on a different scale perhaps, but like the guy who ran the Cinematheque in Paris, Henri Langlois, who said, save everything, everything. And then later on, try to figure out what's great. Because you don't know a great film the minute that it's made. Nobody does. And you see this phrase by critics, an instant classic. That's an impossible thing. You only find out if something's classic if you age it a little bit. That goes for whiskey, and it goes for cinema, and it goes for literature, and it goes for everything. Langlois was so obsessive about his secrecy because they were always trying to, De Gaulle wanted to throw him out of the thing because he was acting like a king. He would collect films from various sources, kept them in his apartment, ultimately needed a museum, a national museum to do it. He was so afraid that he was going to be thrown out of his job that he cut all of the titles off of his films, like all the introductory credits and the end credits. And if they were silent films, he cut all the intertitles, which showed you what people were saying, out of them. Had a filing system in which everything was in code. So if they ever got rid of him, no one would know what they had. It would take years for somebody to see all these things and sort them out and figure out what they were. And it was like he took the films hostage. And he said, if you keep me, I'll put them all back together. But until then, and they did fire him for a period of time in 1968, but there was a riot at the Cannes Film Festival because of that, and they shut down the festival. Paris was shut down altogether.
Yeah.
But Langlois, who, by the way, living in Paris, had food flown in from New York because he didn't think French food was as good as people said. He had Welch's grape jelly and Wonder Bread flown to Paris because he thought this was the greatest stuff in the world. Americans don't, they badmouth it. They don't know how great this is. He was a completely unique individual who put himself at the service of this art form. It was absolutely extraordinary.
Well, finish.
No.
Uh,
you say something.
Well, from the way you're talking and the way things are now, things are kind of a lot the same in the way of the art house scene, with the close, at least in the Detroit area, with the closing of the Maple Theater and the Main Theater, and the almost disappearance of foreign films. They just don't get here unless they're award-winning or some mantra or some advanced publicity.
That's right. I mean, we all hope for, and we're very cheered by, I think it was 2019 when Parasite came out. And Parasite somehow broke through and played in multiplex theaters and won the Academy Award for Best Picture of the Year, as I recall, and was seen by more people than had ever seen a film in another language in this country, including La Dolce Vita and all of the pictures that had made a splash in their day. But it turned out to be kind of an outlier. It's true that lots of films from other countries don't get here. Ultimately, now you can see them. You can sort through your menus on Netflix or on other streaming services, and ultimately you can watch them. But what interests a lot of us around the country, and there are about 130 theaters like ours by latest count. I sound like Joe McCarthy. There are exactly 130 theaters. But it's certainly less than half the number that existed prior to the pandemic that helped to speed the closure of those theaters. One of the problems with theaters like that, and ours, is that most movie theaters don't make a profit on the movies that they show. They make a profit on the food that people buy when they watch those movies. And that's the truth. Commercial theaters pay 90% of what they take in at the door to a distributor the first week. It goes down a little bit after that, but now you almost never see movies that play longer than 1 week because there's rarely an exclusive showing of a movie in a theater anywhere in which you see a line around the block for weeks. They're saturated. It will play 3,000 screens in the United States, and 20 of them will be in the Detroit area. Everybody who wants to see the picture can see it in 7 days. And that means we got more screens to fill up. Many of us thought that ultimately they were going to have to show films from other countries or independent films in order to fill that vacuum. But instead, many of those theaters simply went out of business. And it's tragic. So, yes, in a sense, we're back to square one. We're back in the same situation we were, but movie-going in general is also, in some ways, endangered. There are films every so often that will come out that draw huge numbers of people for a week or two, numbers that were never seen before. But many of those are superheroes movies or films that have gotten an extremely large amount of hype. None of us who are showing little films, like the little French film we opened with last weekend called Holy Cow, about a kid who's raising his family by himself. He's an orphan without warning in a little French village in the Alps, and decides he's going to not be a juvenile delinquent anymore, but he's going to learn how to make cheese, and he's going to win a prize making that cheese. And it's like a sports movie, but from a different country and with fantastic physical beauty, and it's very sweet, and it's not going to appeal to a ton of people. It may get discovered later on when it makes it to cable, if it does. But we had 500 or so happy customers who came to see the movie. Films like that need nurturing. They need a place where people can go and know that they're going to see something that somebody made out of a kind of passionate commitment. That it wasn't necessarily a computer-generated film. It wasn't necessarily written by a committee, people who were assigned a task and went and did it on a particular day. There's a certain pleasure in technology, don't get me wrong, but there's also a certain pleasure in watching someone passionately tell a story. And it may not be something that will please everyone. Movies have different kinds of pacing. They're about different things. They're told in different ways. They demand certain kind of patience, or as often happens in movies like that in theaters all over the country, people will come out and say, you're gonna have to explain that one to me. I don't get the ending. Right, give yourself a chance. Think about it. You may not like the ending ultimately, but give it some thought, think it over, see what you think. I think it was about the 7th week or so of our program in 1974, the first year. A guy came out to the lobby, and he said to me, Elliot, that was the worst picture I've ever seen. I'll see you next week. And I thought, he's got what we're doing here, which is that there's a reason that these movies are appearing, and sometimes there's a reason they're appearing in the sequence in which they're appearing. We try and do the same kind of curation of our ongoing film exhibition in the Detroit Film Theater as the other galleries at the DIA do with their artworks. And he realized, I didn't like that one. It didn't reach me in some way. But I know you're showing these for a reason, and generally I'm intrigued by what you're showing. He can say all of those words, but in that little phrase, that was the worst thing I've ever seen, I'll see you next week, it meant that he understood that at some point there is going to be something that I didn't know this existed. This is incredible. I'm going to remember this experience. And that happens.
All goes into my next question. How do you choose the films to show?
Carefully, and by seeing a lot of the movies. I see at least, people ask me, how many movies do you watch? I don't watch them all on a regular schedule, but I'm always watching stuff. And I would say that, for example, for the summer schedule here, which can be tough because people don't always want to see really demanding films in the summer.
Sure.
Even those of us who want to see visions on film want to lighten up a little bit. But I would say I see at least 15 movies for every movie we show. If you add that up in terms of hours of your life, I've wasted my life completely. Not really completely, because the good parts are amazing. And I've seen things that I might never have discovered if I hadn't been told, hey, take a look at this. This is pretty remarkable. I became alert pretty early on in doing the job of the value of going to other film festivals. Some of that pre-screening for you, of whittling down the world's cinema over the course of a year to 20 or 25 movies that a particular festival will say, these are the ones we want to show, it can be very valuable. I might find only 3 or 4 that I think are right for this program. And the program, I think, has a personality. The audience has a personality. I kind of know at this point, that's not for the DFT. And it doesn't mean it's not worth showing. But we only have this one screen. It's a big theater. And we don't have it for every weekend out of the year anymore because, fortunately, the film program became so popular during its first 20, 25 years, and it's 51 years now. It became so popular during that time that the museum realized, we're not using the theater as much as we should. So now there are musical events going in there. There are occasional rentals that will go in there with our okay. If it's something we want to do with another organization, we'll do that. But it's in demand. And the theater came close twice during the half century I've been there to being in the path of the wrecking ball. There were 2 DIA directors who wanted to take down the theater and build more gallery space there. And both of them wanted to replace the theater with another theater that would be in the basement of the museum, which would be similar to the experience at the Museum of Modern Art. They do a great job in terms of their collection and exhibition, but their theaters suck. They're 2 relatively small little places that are as good as they can be in the kind of situation that they have in the basement, but you still don't feel any kind of exhilaration walking into the room. When the lights go down and the film's on, yeah, you do. But we had a kid last year who came to see one of our family matinees on a Saturday afternoon at Emily Boyer program. She does an amazing job. This little girl walked in with her mom, and the movie was, I think they were about 15 minutes early, They walked in, stood at the back of the theater, and this little kid looked around, and she said, "Mom, can we come back here?" So she hadn't seen the movie yet, but she'd never seen anything like that theater. When someone says, "Let's go to the movies," it means a very different kind of experience. And I think the theater itself is a huge part of what makes the program work. Broken seats and all, and the fact that the seats are too narrow, but in 1927, and those are the original seats, they've been reupholstered a number of times, but people were narrower then, and apparently tinier then, and didn't need legroom then. Something was different, but we found out many years ago that all the seats are different. In, I think it was the late 1970s, the seats were taken out to be refinished, and they didn't realize that the original architect had put in a specific seat cushion and seat back that was unique to that seat. The seats were facing slightly different angles, the seats were farther apart in the center, the seats in the balcony were different, and they made no notation of which cushion went to which seat back. So when they brought them back, it was American Seating in Grand Rapids who had put them in originally in 1927. When they put them back, nothing fit. So they used these big jackhammers to try and get the seats back. The people slid off of them, and it was a nightmare. And then about 15 years ago, or maybe a little longer, you might remember, I can't remember exactly how long ago, but we did get the seats done again. It was the last big seating job that American Seating actually did. We had them done by the Grand Rapids firm that put them in the first place. I think we had a different company do the one where they slid off. And we tried to find what the original upholstery must have looked like. Tried to recreate the original experience, but to keep the audiovisual stuff up to date so that you would get the best of both worlds. And generally that works.
Okay, a couple more questions. When you mentioned going to film festivals, I've been to Toronto many times, and I don't know about you, but I always like to be, when I'm surprised by something.
It's the best.
Yeah, I was like wanting to see Bowling for Columbine, but then I didn't get a ticket, so I was like, so I went to Aki Kaurismäki's Man Without a Face.
My God, yeah.
And it just blew me away.
He's amazing. I mean, you find these people like Kaurismäki, sits around Helsinki and drinks and stews about things, and he's really probably absolutely no fun to be around. But he makes these comedies that are very bleakly funny, and no one else quite has his personality. Every so often a filmmaker like that comes along that has this unique mark. And you're absolutely right. The same thing happens to me at Toronto. I get a pass to go see films in Toronto at the press and so-called industry screenings. They start at 8:30 in the morning, and they're consecutive. So I go from 8:30 in the morning, usually till about 8 in the evening, continuously watching 5 movies, maybe more. And you gotta, they're in a big multiplex, they show them, and they're simultaneously in all 16 of the theaters. So you can't possibly, no human being could ever see them all, because it's not physically possible to do it, unless you ran in and watched, 60 seconds of each one. So sometimes you pick based on a director whose work you want to see. But generally, with 300 movies, there's going to be an awful lot of them that you know nothing about. And so sometimes it depends on the timing. And you say, well, there's one starting across the hall in 5 minutes, and there's seats in there. I've never heard anything about this film, but I'm going to go look at it. I have discovered some of the greatest movies we've ever shown at the DFT that way. And it's really fun when you have no expectations at all. But someone has said, this is worthy of people seeing in a festival that has a really wonderful reputation. There are also festivals that have a smaller palette, and like the New York Film Festival at Lincoln Center, which is the only festival that I've gone to for my entire tenure. I started going in the fall of '73 to prepare for the series, and I've gone every year since. They're now on like 62nd year, 63rd year, something like that. It's brilliantly programmed, and it's much less competitive than the others in terms of getting stuff first. But you see them, and it's like the fillet of all the great stuff that they've seen in other festivals around the world, plus world premieres, plus things that most people may not have thought of as being a great film that came out of another festival, but one with a really interesting and unusual point of view. It's a terrific festival. The one in Telluride used to be great. I've been gone for years. There are great festivals around the world. And what we tried to do originally was not really imitate that, but to have a festival that ran all year, so that you could see a new film every week, and it wouldn't cost you $25 or $30, because the director comes out and says, I hope you enjoy my film, and then the director leaves the stage, and whether you do or you don't, you've just paid $30 for your ticket in order to pay for the director to come to either Toronto or New York or wherever you are. And it's nice to have that happen, but I thought there must be a way when we could show these films for the first time in Detroit and have people see them and presented beautifully. If the director wants to show up, that's great. We don't have the money to bring them in, so we can charge ordinary movie theater ticket prices, and people can get that experience all year round if they just trust us most of the time and come enough. We won't lose so much money that it no longer becomes viable for the museum.
Oh, yeah, you gotta be a business.
And that's always a struggle, because we're not a business. If we were a standalone business, we couldn't make it without the umbrella of the DIA, just like no individual would be able to buy the paintings that are on display at the DIA without donors, without underwriting, without all of the things that the museum needs in order to keep going. It can't be a profit-making institution, but somebody got to pay for it. And fortunately, donors and underwriters and members do. And we go as far as we can with ticket sales, but we don't sell popcorn. And we don't do the thing that other places do, because it's a museum theater. We sort of allow people to take beverages in now. That's changed a little bit.
Do you have janitors who come and clean?
Oh, we have janitors, all right. There were, when I first got there were cockroaches that you could put saddles on. They had been there since 1927. They saw Amelia Earhart lecture at the DIA. They probably know where she is. But it was, they would go up to the theater to die, because they didn't crawl on people, but they were, I shouldn't say this. But nevertheless, a great deal of renovation in every way has been done. And the theater, fortunately, is really, really viable. And it's going to be for the future as well. There's a new generation of people who are coming. Younger people are being seen at the DFT all the time and discovering film and saying, I saw this last week. We never heard of this place. We didn't know there was a theater in the museum. We didn't know that. It's harder to see now because the front of the theater was covered up by renovations that were done a long time ago.
Yeah.
I'll never say anything bad about the DIA with good reason, except for that renovation kind of made the front of the theater look like a 1955 middle school.
Yeah.
They had middle
It
school.
loses the character.
Yeah. That will be corrected someday. And the theater can be, the facade of the theater will once again be put back the way it was. The old cast iron marquee that was in front of the theater is in storage for that future day. It was not thrown away. It was cut into 3 big pieces and can be resoldered and put back together when cooler heads prevail, when all of you demand that happen. But in the meantime, the theater still stands. It's withstood a lot, and people are still coming. And there was one other time, I'll close with this unless you've got some other thing you want me to ramble on about. But
Just about it.
well, the Detroit Film Theater schedule, please take one. We had an architect, Michael Graves, who was an extraordinary architect, was hired originally to do that renovation of the museum. And he had a terrible medical crisis and was not able to continue. But one of the things he was asked to do was to demolish the theater and replace it with an underground theater. And he said, it may not be the most historically significant theater in America, but I will not do that, he told the museum's director at the time. He said, I won't do it because A, it's beautiful, but B, it's used. People come every week to to see films. They love it. It has a life. He said, I see renovated theaters and restored theaters all over the country that get fixed, and then people don't know what to put in them, and they don't have audiences. You want to come and see Neil Diamond for $100? Maybe, maybe not. This one, he said, has a purpose and a life and is loved by audiences. And he said, I won't touch it. And it was a very moving experience to hear him say that. And I think that's how a lot of the audience feels as well.
Yeah, just one more thing about the summer season. I want to especially highlight the Kurosawa movies. I mean, I remember seeing a Kuro at the Art Institute way back when. Where did you get those, or how did that come about? I guess
Our first year, we showed a lot of Kurosawa films. And what happens over time, those were the old 35 millimeter film days, those prints would get scratched and torn, and they would go from one theater to another, and after a while, their useful life had disappeared, and it cost thousands of dollars to make a new print, and they would go away. Then came the era of DVD and other things, and people could sort of see these movies again. But one of the wonderful things about the era in which we live is, at least for movie lovers, is the digital restoration science has become really remarkably excellent. And the original negatives of many of the Kurosawa films, not The Seven Samurai, because that's extremely popular, not Rashomon, because that's extremely popular, those films existed in restored versions. But the 8 that we're showing in the last 2 weeks in August, which you can see in this beautiful layout here on our brochure, these are 8 Kurosawa films that are magnificent pictures, but have not been available in theaters for many, many years to see on the big screen. And he was a guy who made visually astonishing movies. Films, everybody knows Seven Samurai. You take a look at a film like High and Low, which is a thriller about a guy who is told that his son has been kidnapped and he's got to sell his shoe company and lose everything he has in order to get the kid back. It's a detective thriller, but it's fantastic to look at. Yojimbo, a movie that inspired Clint Eastwood, Sergio Leone to remake it as A Fistful of Dollars. I got to have lunch with Clint Eastwood when his first movie came out, the one he made himself, Play Misty for Me. I was a kid. I think he was a kid too. It must have been, 1971, something like that. And I tried to be cool, and I said to him, you're sitting across from me, Mr. Eastwood, I wanted to ask you about Akira Kurosawa. Then, of course, Fistful of Dollars for Sergio Leone. He looked at me, and he said, we all knew it was based on Yojimbo Kid. That was my last question for Clint. I haven't seen him since. But the film, Yojimbo, is, your jaw will drop when you see it. And when you see it on the big screen, restored in this 4K, which is the equivalent in the digital world of 70 millimeter version, all of these films will blow your mind and remind you what a genius Kurosawa was. And one of the most amazing is Throne of Blood, which maybe is, and Ikiru too, of course, but very different kinds of films. And there's going to be a lecture, not a lecture really, but an introduction to Throne of Blood by our curator, Chaska Kirchhoff, who's also the person who's handling the Guest of Honor exhibition at the DIA about armor. And the armor that's used in the samurai pictures of Akira Kurosawa is so amazing, and she loves those films too. And she's going to introduce Throne of Blood and talk about the armor in the film and how it relates to the armor that's on display at the DIA. So bringing all of these things together with various art forms on display at the DIA and having the cinema included is a great thing for me, so that people don't believe that we're two separate things. That there's a movie theater with a museum attached, or a museum with a movie theater attached. But we are one, and celebrating all of the arts. Movies are getting their due at the DIA, and we're very pleased about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we just have time for a couple of questions because we close at 8. Do anybody have, want to sound off?
You know,
Go ahead.
You know, I saw the Kurosawa Film Festival years ago, so I'm really glad to be able to see this. I want to go to this one. But that was great when it came out. It was very educational. I did just want to make a comment, asking you what was a memorable event. But I wanted to share with you that when the Corporation came out, I went to the theater expecting not a lot of people. I got to stand in line that went to the street and saw that it went to the corner, and then it turned the corner and went further beyond sight. You know, was there any other film that did that?
Sure, lots of them.
Yeah?
And lots of them that should have, but that didn't. And there were 80 people sitting in that room instead of 1,000 that it fits. And to your point, you were surprised, I was surprised. When I first got there, that first season, in order to save money, since I said I wanted to do a movie every week, they said, okay, here's what we'll do in order to make it a little bit less tough financially. Every other week you can use the auditorium, but the other weeks, every other week, you have to show the films in the lecture hall, which is a small room on the ground floor of the museum. There were about 300 seats in there, and we could only show 16 millimeter in that room. And they said, choose the films that you think aren't going to do well, and we'll put those in the lecture hall. And the ones you think will do well, put those in the auditorium. And I sort of thought to myself, if I knew which pictures were going to do well, I would go to Hollywood now and produce movies. Because everybody thinks that, you know. Anyway, make a long story short, the first weekend we had a French-Canadian film called Mon Oncle Antoine, and the Detroit Free Press, thanks to Susan Stark, who said, I'll review every one of the films that you show, but I'm going to do it honestly. She loved the first film. There was something like 12 inches of snow, and we had 800 people. It was great. Second week, I showed a black and white French film by Louis Malle about an extremely depressed alcoholic who was not able, after treatment, to really come to terms with his life and ends up committing suicide. And I said, well, here's one for the lecture hall. It's a great film, but who's going to come and see this once they find out what the plot is? It's too much of a downer. We had a line out to Woodward because the review said the film was a masterpiece, but pointed out, you know, what its subject matter was. And at that point, we ran the film into the auditorium. The audience was so patient. They followed us into the auditorium, we took it up to the projection booth, we ended up showing it in there, and from then on, all the films were shown in the theater because we don't know. Sometimes we have a feeling, like when we got to do the premiere of Stop Making Sense, and the distributor said, this is not for the DIA, he told me. He didn't want to sell us the film. He said, this is not for the DIA, your people won't like this. In other words, your people are old fogies, this is too cool. I said, I don't know, let me try it. We sold out every performance, as happened with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Kurosawa's Ron, which had the best 3 days of any theater in the United States. These things happen, but you don't always know when they're going to happen. If they're great, you hope they will. It's difficult now, more difficult, to create an event film, because there's always a portion of the audience that says, I'll wait and see it on TV at home. But those aren't the people we've depended on over the years anyway. It's the people who find the experience of seeing it in the theater, that memorable thing. No matter how much you say, I'm going to turn the lights off and not answer the phone at home, I'm not going to get distracted. Of course you do. Of course you stop and get something to eat. Of course I do. But in the theater, when the lights go down, you know that you're giving yourself over to somebody's vision. And if it's going to work, if the movie's going to work, that's where it's going to work best. It's not just that there are a lot of other people there. It's that you are alone with that film. And one interesting thing I've noticed is that in the last couple of years, fewer people are using their phones to check their Facebook feed or whatever it is during movies. They're now thinking, I can do it later. And they're more attentive to the films. And I will always take, fewer people who are more attentive than to pack the place with people who don't know why they're there.
Hey, one more question.
What are the main generators of interest in film these days? Used to be like the New York Times or major newspapers in Detroit would have a hired hand, hired critic to review movies and recommend them. What today is the main drive that popularizes obscure movies to show up at, to motivate people to show up at like the DFT to see something like that?
I don't know. I have been mourning for many years the loss of newspapers, of course, the loss of movie critics. I used to curse them on days when they didn't get it and wrote, really stupid reviews of films. But even then, a film could be turned into an event. Now, I guess it's social media. I'm not good at doing social media, and I don't think social media does this kind of film exhibition as well. There were certain critics who were really important to my generation, and we would run to the newsstand and get the New Yorker to find out what Pauline Kael thought of whatever it was this week. And periodically, she knew she was important. She would have a film she wanted to make news out of, and would do it in her reviews of films like Nashville or Last Tango in Paris. She knew she was making news, and also when she didn't like something, she knew when she was, rattling the cages of the world. But they were always events. They were always things that people either went out of their way to avoid or went out of their way to see, but still they came. And I don't know if anything has replaced that. I think on one level,
like Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic?
Those numbered things are always annoying to me because they don't mean anything. There are a million movies that have 100% that I wouldn't show because they're lousy. And it doesn't mean I don't think the public knows what it likes. They do. There's nothing wrong with that. But in a way, it's kind of arrogant in one way, and in another way, it's also the reason we don't have a suggestion book in the lobby and never have. We want to show people films that they've never heard of and have them discover them and tell us what they thought or tell their friends what they thought. For us right now, word of mouth is the biggest factor, but word of mouth can only do so much between Friday and Sunday. It takes quite a while for a movie to get traction, and movie engagements are much shorter now. The window to go to cable or streaming is 30 days now. It's not like, well, I want to see it now. I know it'll be on later, but that's half a year from now. I don't know. No. Less than a month from when most movies open at the DFT, you can probably find them on some streaming service. We know that. The audience knows that. And yet, there is a sizable enough audience that says, we don't care. It's not about rushing to see it. It's about seeing it in this way. The idea of being there first to see something on the first night all over the country, a lot of that has changed over the years. In terms of reviews, nothing's replaced that for us. Many years ago, there was a little film that I heard about. It was playing at midnights in New York. It was called Eraserhead. And it was made by this kid named David Lynch. And I called the movie's distributor and said, look, I'm going to be in New York. I want to get into a screening of this film. And they laughed and said, oh, sure, Elliot, no problem. But, believe me, this is not something you'd want to play at the museum. Well, that, of course, music to my ears. And I said, well, let me be the judge of that. And they said, okay, I tell you what, we'll set up a screening for you so you don't have to go to the midnight thing. We'll set up a screening in our offices up here, really fancy offices. I went, saw it alone in their offices, and I came out and said, what do I have to do to get this movie? It's unbelievable. This kid is so talented, this Lynch. And they tried to talk me out of it. And they said, we don't have any theater in Detroit that's going to run it at midnight or run it at all. But we don't want you to ruin, the DFT. It's great. So they said, okay, fine. They had it one night. I'll stop in a second, I promise. My friend Susan Stark, who really is responsible for getting us off the ground with her reviews at the Free Press, I showed it to her. And she wrote in the Detroit Free Press that this was a film so odious and so horrible, so bad on every level, and then she made it personal. She said that Elliot Wilhelm, who programs the series, is risking the reputation of the Detroit Institute of Arts by presenting something, and my boss said, what are we gonna do? I said, we're gonna sell out is what we're gonna do. And sure enough, that day, after that review appeared, we sold in advance for the first time, I think, 1,000 tickets to the 7 o'clock and the 9:30 show. Here's the punchline. Very few years later, David Lynch made The Elephant Man. The Elephant Man brought David into mainstream respectability, and it was also a great film. Susan Stark reviewed The Elephant Man in the paper and raved about it, and said halfway through her review, you could see hints of David Lynch's genius even in his early film Eraserhead. And I almost physically wanted to put my hands around her throat. What do you mean? You said they should fire me for showing this. But everybody's memories, that's why you can't declare instant classics. I don't know what's going to sell out. I never know what's not going to sell out. We just keep showing what we want to show, and ultimately millions of people see these movies, and it's great, but it's a strange business, but it's been fun. And to have a museum that has never said to me once, we don't think this is right for us. We don't think this is we think this is dangerous. We think that maybe, some of our donors will be offended, something like that. That's never happened. And that, to me, is worth the 10 times my salary that, of course, I should be getting. Because it's great. And long may they continue.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Elliot.